Can you hear me this time? Can you hear me yet?
Yeah, I got you.
Okay. I don't know what happened there. Yeah. Sorry about that.
Sorry. So this will be round 2.
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know what happened. I couldn't hear you. You couldn't hear me. I couldn't do anything. I tried to refresh, got the application error.
It wasn't the hate speech, was it? Wasn't my
No.
hate speech.
No. I'd reach out to the government. Yeah. So I heard up to, I mean, we can go, how do you want to do this? Just, you want to redo your opening to keep it in line, or how do you want to do it? Either way.
Sure. I guess we could kind of start from the top.
Okay, sure.
Why not? So here I am, Nelson versus Michael, taking on Michael. The individual's right of free speech, freedom of speech, is unlimited in its content relating to speech and should never be limited in any way by government. Now, when I was formulating this, I was really specifically talking about the limits that government can legitimately place on speech, and it is my contention that there are none. And so government's role is to protect the individual's rights, not to decide what the individual can and cannot say. Freedom of speech with respect to what the government has a legitimate right to restrict is, again, nothing. And speech is how individuals express themselves, and the right of self-expression is what I would consider a fairly universal and natural right of every individual. Restricting free speech is really restricting thought. And so you can go back to like 1984 and you have the speech crime or thought crimes. And so, and thought crimes were decided on what people would say out loud. Of course, sometimes they were just on what they thought people might think, making sure people think the right politically correct ways and that. So again, in the other opening, what else I talk about in the other opening is the idea that of speech. When we're talking about free speech, again, we're talking about specifically related to what the government can or cannot do, not the fact that I can go on Facebook and scream and put people down, and then Facebook deletes my link or my account, and I cry free speech, and you say, no, that's not applicable here, right? I can't go into your house and start screaming at you, and then you said, you kindly asked me to leave, and I said, what's wrong with you? Don't you know the First Amendment? Right. So we're not talking about any of that. We're just specifically talking about what the government can and cannot restrict on the individual. And so that, there's a lot of applications of free speech. We can get into those if you want, money and expressing oneself. But so I guess we could take it from there.
Okay. We did some clarification in the last round, I guess. Appreciate you letting me come back after a little equipment malfunction there.
Sure.
All right.
Thanks for coming back.
No problem. When it comes to freedom of speech, like we clarified before, I want to clarify again that you are saying that under no circumstances should the government limit free speech. And by no circumstances, I want to be clear what I'm asking you. In instances of inciting violence, in instances of obscene speech, in instances of cases we'll talk about later on of hate speech, you are saying that in none of these cases or others similar to it, the government should come in and limit the right of an individual to speak, or limit what that individual can say or how they can say it.
Well, so the Supreme Court has put a distinction on even incitement of violence. And it's if you are standing there with a gun saying, let's attack these people, let's shoot them or something like that, then that's not just speech, right? There's like a call to action.
Right.
And it's a legitimate potential force that you are about to impose on somebody. Okay. And, in a case like that, so we could get into like a libertarian scenario where we could say a case like that, the individual who you're calling to action against would have a right to defend himself against you, right?
Sure.
And I think that would be the most perhaps the best way to take on an argument like that, or a case like that. Now, in the way that it is today, I would still say that it's fairly similar, that if you you make certain aggressive speeches against somebody, and that person is he has a legitimate belief that his life is, or his property is, at threat, then he has the individual right to react and to defend himself.
Okay. And
so you can start screaming back and forth. But I don't think that the government should come in and say, you called him, even if we can think of the most abusive, hateful words, the N-word or something like that, then the government doesn't have a role in coming in and say, no, you can't say that, off to prison with you. Right? So
I just want to make sure that there's a distinction between a threat, or what someone holds as a legitimate threat. So if I were to come to somebody's house and say, I am here, I am going to kill you, and they shoot me, they are not violating my freedom of speech, and the government would not come in and punish them for murder. They were defending themselves because I made an aggressive, I want to say aggressive speech, but we're arguing speech. I mean, if that's not speech, what would you call a direct threat? That seems to me like your right to make a threat is not protected by the government, because the other person's right to respond to your threat is protected by the government.
Well, in a case like that, some person A goes to person B's house and starts screaming at person B and making what a reasonable person would say is a legitimate threat, then yeah, I think person B, especially if you're talking about the castle doctrine, right? If he's in your house, or he's at your house and he's aggressing against you, physically aggressing, not if he's just standing there if he's standing there politely and he's telling you how much he hates you, then I think that's not necessarily a legitimate threat. But the person could be in the right to defend himself if it elevated in some manner.
Now, in that case where the person is standing there politely saying how much they hate me and how little they think of me, if I were to call the police, would the police be justified at that point to removing the individual, even if we are both on public property?
If you're on public property, I think that in most cases it would be, you should be able to leave the public property and leave that person. Now, again, I think if that person's abusing you, and this is where we get into the kind of the issues of public property, right?
Right.
Who really has the right to that piece of property?
And what actions can take place on that property. I mean, if we agree that words can be abusive, which, I assume that that's not an argument, that we do agree that some language is considered abusive. So demeaning language has been shown to demoralize or reduce individuals. That's why we have things called hate speech. That's why we have terms like verbal abuse.
But you know some of the words that are trigger words in hate speech? Like if I ask you, Michael, where are you born? That's a trigger word. Right? That's trigger speech. That could be seen as hate speach.
Now,
according to some universities.
Now again, let's not conflate the university standards with the governmental standards. Under any governmental law I was able to look up, asking somebody where you were born would not be considered hate speech, would not be considered inciting in any way. Now, campuses are not considered governmental property in this same sense as we agreed on. Like, we don't want to hold the government, the United States government, up and blame them for a very strict standard at a university. We both agree on that, right?
I do think that mostly it should be applied on the university. Again, if somebody's getting up in the classroom and screaming, I think it could be argued that he is harming the rights of the other individuals in the classroom to get that which they paid for, right? Which is an education.
Well, I assume that
obstruction of property or something.
Right. I assume that the reason that it's allowed, discrimination of speech is allowed on campus properties, is that because they provide processes and formats in which those people are able to say whatever they wish but just not the campus itself is a safe place for students, like you said, to they're paying for an education, they are owed an education that they paid for that's free of certain, harm to come to them, which I personally believe words can be harmful. And that is the argument that I'm going to stick to, that says the government does have the ability and the responsibility to curtail free speech in the event that, in the cases where it is demonstrably harmful or will be harmful in the future.
And that's where I think that's really what we would enormously disagree on, is that government has a right to decide what can and cannot be said in the public square, even or on the universities, because it is a public university. If we're talking about public university, a private university, you could just say it's private property, right? And they kind of have their right to do what they should do. They should allow for a great deal of speech, because it is an institution where you're supposed to have a discussion in the marketplace of ideas. And we don't want the university deciding this is the kind of ideas that you should be considering. Mm-hmm. Right.
Go ahead.
I was just say with the public university, it is a government property, but at the same time, yeah, people are paying to be there, and you could make property arguments there that individuals are paying for seats in classrooms, and if somebody's coming in and abusing them, and they're at least in the classroom or something like that. But the issue that I think we could get into is the words. You talk about hate speech. What is hate speech? What words should we say that the government can restrict?
And I think we both would agree on, and we should make it clear that the cases in which free speech is limited are rare, that the majority of speech is protected by the government per the Constitution, that there are only very rare cases in which freedom of speech is limited. And those cases, I would say, directly involve individuals being harmed by words. So in cases where language is used against, say, the government, the government protects individuals to speak out in any way they wish against our government. It is in our Constitution to be allowed to do that. The government does not have the right, and does not, in my understanding, does not limit an individual speaking out against the government in any way. Would you agree with that?
Yes. While you were gone, I mentioned some historical acts where they have limited, and they found it quite atrocious. The Alien and Sedition Act,
right?
Probably familiar, right? And that was under Adams, and I think he signed the Constitution, so he was there for the First Amendment, and then he didn't like it when he became in power, right? Which is Acton's law. And then you have wartime. People were imprisoned in the Civil War for speaking out. By the way, Virginia almost seceded over the Alien and Sedition Act, but then Thomas Jefferson got elected and pardoned everybody. So there are rather atrocious examples where the government has acted against individuals that have spoken against it.
And those have set a precedent that which we do not, the government no longer interacts against or acts against people who speak out against the government, no matter how insulting or obscene their language is regarding the government. Do we agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, there's some other more modern examples. I think a teacher was fired for saying disagreeing with his employer. His employer happened to be a public school, so Supreme Court got his job back. But so there are examples where people have complained about the government and been fired by the government for doing so. And of course, you can get into, if you're with the CIA and you sign a contract with them, then you get into contract law. Sure. So you're in the military, you can't talk about politics in the military, right?
Well, I assume you wouldn't be able, because you're a representative of the military, you have some sort of standard that you must adhere to, is what I would assume.
Yeah, there's pretty restrictive laws of, basically when you sign up for the military, you become property of the military and you give up a lot of your rights.
But you voluntarily give them up. So it's not that the government is taking them from you. You are handing them, I guess, I don't want to say handing your rights over, but you're basically saying you will act in a certain way. So
Yeah,
I just wanted to make sure that it's stated that the government overall protects the freedom of speech. Now there is certain circumstances where the government steps in and limits free speech, and that would be like we talked about earlier, inciting actions. You said now that there's a specific definition for inciting violence, right?
Yeah, so speech in and of itself, like you can walk around and say, "Hey, let's overthrow the government," and that's just speech, right? You can pass out communist pamphlets. People do it all the time, talking about overthrowing the government. But
now,
as long as it's what?
No, I just was going to say, now that is, again, as we agreed, that's okay because they are speaking directly against the government. Now, if a group of if an individual got up in public and said, "Here is this citizen. This person is a horrible person. This person needs to die," that would be inciting violence against an individual, and that action would be handled by the government as something different than someone saying we need to overthrow the government with a different government or different political philosophy, because that the speech is targeting a single individual. Then the government steps in as its responsibility is to that individual to protect them, as it would any individual that was targeted by a group. Even if all that has been done is someone has said openly in public, "Here's an individual, attack them."
Well, again, if it would depend on the nature of the accusation or the call to action. So it would really depend on the situation and how legitimate the person's screams were, right? If the person gets up and in the middle of an auditorium and starts saying something about somebody else, but there's no reason to think that he might actually act. And you could say, well, we can investigate whether or not he's actually going to make a legitimate threat against the individual. So it's just a difference between speech and more than speech, right?
So in your argument, where would an individual say calling another individual on the phone and convincing them to kill themselves fall as compared to an individual standing in a public sphere around like-minded individuals and calling for the death of someone? To me, it seems that if we can hold one individual responsible, as has happened recently, we would be able to hold the other person both legally responsible, and then the government should step in and limit that. And then I assume that we'll both agree that if a government can rightfully punish, then the government can also rightfully regulate to prevent.
So I haven't read a lot on that case, but we're talking about the case, of course, where the young lady really talked him into it, convinced him to do it. He got out of the truck, even said, "Get back in, do it." There's a lot about a potential dangerous precedent that has set about speech and what that speech leads to, right? That whether or not government has the legitimate right to come and hold her responsible for her actions. There's a lot of debate about that, and that's something that I find it a little difficult to say that her, without actually even being there, right? She's not even there. So he's just looking at words on a phone, right?
Right. Now, I think to me, I find it less of a problem because as I understand it, individuals and how they use language can have influence over other people. So I assume that we would both agree that words, articulately spoken words, rational words, arguments, can influence people to do one thing. Now, that same power of influence applies when you're influencing someone to do something evil, doing something negative, or doing something good. So you can motivate someone to do better. You can also motivate somebody to get back into the car and to kill themselves. So if words have that power, and we both recognize, well, I assume we both recognize that they at least have the power to motivate if they also have and if everything that we know about the case is true, they have the power also to convince someone to take their own life. I mean, that is something we can't just simply ignore. I mean, words are bullets. If we ignore them, they don't just pass right through us. I mean, as South Park would say.
Well, I would say, what would you say if he had gotten out of the truck and decided not to do it?
I mean,
I think there's a big difference between her saying something and him actually acting on the words that she spoke, right? Because I mean, if I tell you, hey, you should go out, rob the liquor store, here's how you do it. They have liquor. They don't have liquor stores here anymore, so.
Oh, they still have them here. They're just closed on Sundays.
Okay. They used to be. I think they used to be here too. But anyways, but yeah, you can go out, rob the liquor store. Here's how you do it, right? Mm-hmm. Now, if I'm just saying that, and I don't have, there's no reason to believe I'm going to actually do it. I'm just saying, hey, you should go do it. Mm-hmm. But I could say here, I say, hey, Michael, when we're done, I want you to go out. Yeah, it's Saturday, local liquor store. They're probably closed. Perfect, right? Nobody's around. Okay, I want you to rob them. Now, if I were to actually convince you to do it and you were to do it, then I could be an accomplice in the crime, right? I think that's a legitimate.
All right. Now, so if you have a public speaker, somebody standing on a soapbox in a public setting, what are they trying to do? Are they just simply stating their belief, or are they trying to convince a crowd of something, one thing or another? If you could be held accountable for convincing me to rob the liquor store, then I don't see how you could say that someone in a public setting couldn't also be held accountable for convincing a group of people to say, go kill someone or go murder someone that they didn't like, or burn down a church, or whatever they might be inciting them to do or in convincing them to do. And if that person can be held responsible, then it seems reasonable that the government should be able to limit the type of speech that person would be making. They can say, you can't convince people to go burn down a church in public, because that leads to people going to burn down churches in public. So we're just saying you can't do that. And if you do that, you're going to be held accountable for attempted church burning down. I don't know if that's a crime or not, but you get my point.
Yeah, I would still say that it depends on what action was taken. So if an individual just gets up and sometimes you could just look at people, oh, it's a crazy guy. He's out there just yakking, right? Mm-hmm. He doesn't mean anything. Now, if you actually are able to get together a band of people, mm-hmm. and you can legitimately think this person is actually going to go out and aggress on property, right? On life, liberty, and property, then you could perhaps say there might be a case there. But again, I think you would have to, does the government just come in and arbitrarily say, okay, this is too much? I think there would have to be a victim somewhere.
I mean, I agree that our government is reactionary, but one of their reactions they do is they place sanctions and limitations on what people can do after something has already happened. So, for instance, we now know that if you convince somebody to kill themselves, that is a punishable crime. There's precedent been set. It seems to me that if we can accept any case in which the government would come in and legitimately restrict an individual's free speech, whether that individual be the leader of a political party, be the leader of a large group. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that there's going to be a limit where a person must be speaking to a crowd over 50 for these rules to apply to them. Now, it may be that they never get even noticed by the government because their group is only 5 and it doesn't ever actually do anything, but those same restrictions would still apply to those people, even if they don't ever have any actions that require any response by the government. Just because they ignore the regulations doesn't mean that they wouldn't exist or wouldn't be appropriate for them had they not ignored them.
Yeah, and again, I think the case of the young lady that's a very difficult case, and I reserve complete judgment on that, but I think it's pushing it a little far myself. Like we said, something that actually did happen, and she convinced him to do it. So there's there's an argument that could be made there, but I'm a little hesitant on that. I am definitely I don't think government should go out and decide in the cases you're talking about where you're talking to groups of people about certain things that may or may not should be done, should not be done, something like that.
So we had broached in our first round, and we can get to what I think you and I both find the most interesting cases is hate speech. Now, you define hate speech.
Yeah, and by the way, and of course, as I said, that was really kind of the intent of the. Yeah,
since we have 20 left, let's we've covered the groundwork, so let's get to the cases. So, do you want to make an argument or use a specific example of hate speech that you think would be appropriate? Any sort, because what you said could be called hate speech is asking somebody where they're from. And while that may be true on some college campuses or in some groups or in some workplaces, that is not, as in my understanding, what would be considered hate speech by the U.S. government.
Yeah, so Steven Crowder went on college campuses and he was asking people, do you consider this hate speech? And a lot of people said yes. I even had a friend that was complaining about being racist, asking her, is she from China? Things like that. I'm like, people ask me where I'm from. If I met you, I say, hey, where are you from? I really don't see what the big deal is. My wife is from China, right? So people ask her, are you from Korea all the time? She kind of laughs at it. But so there are a lot of things where that is happening on college campuses that I could see someday eventually being pushed into the public sphere.
Okay.
Right. I mean, we could talk about slippery slope, but I think I do not in any way think the slippery slope argument is a fallacy. I think it's absolutely true. You get your foot in the door, start opening the door a little more, get more and more things in there. And so I think hate speech is a big black box that once opened, once we start restricting people's speech, where do we end, right? Where do we stop? I'm offended by this. These people are offended by that. This is very hurtful to them, right? So I think it's a big black box, a very dangerous precedent to set, to say that certain words cannot be uttered.
Well, see, I think there is a categorical difference between making what I would consider a hate speech statement, saying, or a statement that's not hate speech, saying, for instance, I hate the act of homosexuality. I don't think that is hate speech. Now, if you those who participate in the act of homosexuality they're sinful. But then you could turn around and say, you could attack individuals. You could say, like the signs, God hates facts. I think that is hate speech. It is targeting specific groups as opposed to the conceptual act. So when you switch the target from, say, the abstract group, like we talked about, I don't know if it was this one or the other one, but the abstract group being the government or the particular religion or the particular sexuality, and you instead start talking about the individuals, when those individuals are attacked, harm comes to them, or at least potential harm comes to them, and if they can be harmed, it is the government's responsibility to protect them. Just like if you or I were to be harmed, they protect us from physical violence. It seems only reasonable that they should be able to protect everyone from verbal violence.
Well, again, I would say you have a right of life, liberty, and property, but you don't have a right to a right of feelings, right? Of positive feelings all the time. And so, again, any word could hurt someone else's feelings. And so of course, the example you mentioned, nobody likes them. I think everybody is offended by them. The Westboro Baptist Church.
Sure. I just use them because they're the most common example.
The most offensive group, right?
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, they pretend to be Baptists, and they offend the Christian church. They offend Baptists. They offend everybody, right?
Right.
And so nobody likes them, but I think they have a right to go out there and say what they want to say. Now, I would say that in some cases there have been like biker clubs that have gone and prevented them from entering. And so, you know what? I think that a little private action, as long as it's not as long as they're not physically aggressing on these people, just standing there and preventing them from walking into a public ceremony or something like that. Yeah.
So I don't think we disagree too much on that point. I think the, counter protests as I would have displayed are perfectly fine. But my point is that the government protects our right to speak against concepts and ideas, and even to speak out against groups, but it doesn't protect our right to attack individuals. It's the government's responsibility to protect individuals, even if it's from other Americans. It would protect us from outside attacks as well as inside attacks. Now we can, I think our argument is going to come down is whether we can consider something that is said verbally an attack. And I would say we can, and I would argue that it is, because one thing I think the government attacks is our ability to make decisions for ourselves. Now, when we are forced to listen to speech that we're walking by, it's not like once something is said to us, we can decide, no, this isn't the content that I want to listen to, so I'm just going to walk on by and not listen to it. Once it's already said, it's already been said. So you have to, I don't know how you would even avoid hate speech if you're walking through a public place and somebody starts shouting at you. It's not like you can choose not to go to a concert or not to go to a rally or not to go to some sort of other venue. If you're just walking by and someone is accosting you, that's where I think the difference is. People have their right to say it, but they can't have the right to force the other person to listen, which is what they do, and which I think is what is protected by the government. Protects people from being forced to listen to hate speech.
Yeah, and again, the public property is kind of a fuzzy area. There's a lot of problems when you get into public property, right? Because who owns it, all that. Is the person sitting there in his underwear screaming at people, or is it the person walking by? So now, as far as being forced to listen, if you're on your own property, then I think you could say this person is violating my property rights by putting noise into my front yard, right? That I don't want to listen to. And there's covenants. Of course, in neighborhoods, there's covenants. You can also get into HOAs, like all sorts of things with private property. Now, on public property, again, it's a very much more difficult topic. Do you have a right? If you're just walking by the guy, I don't think there's any threat. There's any reason to restrict his speech necessarily. If he's harassing people, that's different, right?
Well, let me give you a counterexample. Say, do you think the government has the right to limit the advertisements people put on their vehicles driving through town? If someone puts an obscene, say somebody being beheaded, say an obscene cartoon on a billboard and drives it through town, should the government reach in? That is an obscene. Most people in the area believe it obscene. Are they justified in having that person remove that advertisement from their vehicle?
Yeah, so this is something I actually thought a little about. It's kind of like cussing over the public airways, I guess you could also say, right?
Exactly. We can think of anything that already exists. The government regulates whether or not you can cuss over the airwaves through fines, not through, jailing anyone, but through punishing or fining certain stations for doing it. We have regulations on our highways about what can be presented, and what is considered obscene, what is not considered obscene, what type of license plate you're allowed to have. There's all these sorts of rules, and if we don't have a problem with those, I don't understand how we can justify having a problem with limiting free speech when someone's simply saying something. I don't see a difference in those. Now, I don't know if you do or not.
I do see a difference. I guess you could say, yeah, it is speech, right? It's expressing oneself on your car, on your shirt, or something like that.
Right.
Now, it has been said that walking around with a curse word on your shirt or most anything on your shirt is not could have a naked woman on your shirt or something like that, or a naked statue or whatever on your shirt, and people have as far as I know, you have a right to do that, right? It's not that it's not restricted anyways.
We had a case here in our local area of someone having, this is going to sound weird, but having two stick figures having sex on the back of their car in big letters saying something like "making my stick figure family." I don't know if you guys have them out there, little stick figures on the back of the cars. So they had a big picture on the back that had two stick figures having sex. Now, I found it was funny, but the police pulled him over, and it was ruled that he had to remove that because it was obscene and went against the obscene rules. I mean, we have obscenity rules in both our local and I assume our national government. So if those rules exist and it's justified for them to limit what they put on the car, it would seem that if he was saying something comparable over and over in a public place, the police officer would be justified to limit that free speech of the individual.
Yeah, and again, this a public road, right? So it's a road supposedly owned by everybody, and if somebody out there wants to put limits on it, that's a difficult proposition. Because I could say that if you had private roads, then the owner of the road could say, no, you're not allowed to have that sticker on your car, right? Yeah. So, I
think we agree that if it's a private property, the person can, if they don't want certain things, they can have it. If they want to have an entire road line with six figures having sex, that is also their right. But we're talking about when it comes to the government, the reason that those laws exist is because certain things are obscene to a certain number of people, and they are protecting the right of those people from not having to see it. So if we agree that right exists, the person not having to see obscene material that they don't wish to, then it seems to me we also have to protect the right of the person not having to hear obscene speech that they don't wish to. I don't know that I see a difference between those two.
Is it obscene or hate speech?
Well, I would assume the hate speech is considered obscene. Is there?
Well, again, because hate speech is a pretty fuzzy term, right? Because as I mentioned, obscene, you could somewhat objectively define obscenity as either, it has been defined as like an exposed private part, a nipple or something like that.
Right. Well, I could imagine a situation where there would be a posted advertisement that has something horrible happening to a particular racial group being posted somewhere, and that being made for that to be taken down. So say, I hate to be so crude in my example, but a poster depicting a lynching saying, "Make America great again," with a lynching or something out here. I'm from down here in the South, so that maybe makes more sense to me. I don't know what the equivalent would be from where you are, but I could see where someone posting that up, that would be offensive to people. If that's posted up where next to a road, that would be taken down, of course, right? And we agree that would be the right thing for the government to do, to come in and take that sign down because it's being offensive. I would say that sign would be hate speech. Now, what would be the difference between someone coming and standing in the same spot by the same road, speaking about how that should come back, those, people deserve to die, and they're saying all these things? I don't see the difference. If we can agree that the image should be taken down, why we would disagree that the language should be curtailed?
Well, I'd say the owner of the road. Again, when I'm talking about hate speech, I just mean in general the way people talk, right? In a conversation here, call out has a right to restrict it, but when we're engaged, we're chatting, and because again, if I bring this back to hate speech, what is hate speech, right? I mean, often you mentioned the sign example.
Right.
I won't repeat it, but is hate speech, because some people say hate speech is just Christianity, is hate religion, right?
Right.
Hate speech. Now, could we restrict that? Because if we're saying we can restrict hate speech, shouldn't we just restrict religions too?
I mean, we do restrict religions. There's no religious. I mean, there's separation of schools and religion. So,
well, that's not. It's not constitutional, and I mean, we don't have enough time to get into that.
Sure,
but
sure.
we do say, according to Jefferson's letter to the Baptist Church, he wrote separation of church and state, meaning that the government can't get into church practices.
Right. Well, what I mean here in this instance is the government does restrict the teaching and the preaching or the saying of religion from certain areas already. So
on government property.
On government property. So if we,
which I disagree with, but I don't think that's correct. But we don't get into that.
Right.
State property. I mean, state
right.
property specifically.
So,
federal government. Okay.
Right, but state properties they do restrict it. So
I think you have a state religion. Do you have a state religion? I know Virginia had one. Some states had an official state religion at the founding of the country, but
I mean, I'm sure we do. I know that someone tried to pass a bill that said all our rights were divinely given.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to move to Tennessee.
Yeah.
I wanted to move to Tennessee.
That's why I wanted to move away.
I want to get out of Seattle. We could trade spots. So
yeah, I
really like that bill. It said it recognized the fact that rights come from God, not from government, right? And I think, I would say I don't know if you would agree with the second half of that, or that rights don't come from government.
I mean, I would say rights most certainly come from government, and given that they're defined by government. I mean, if an individual is the only one around, then he makes his own rights. If there's two individuals, it's the strongest individual that defines the rights. And if there's 10,000, then you form a government that does the best it can for everyone by minimizing pain and maximizing.
Okay, this kind of gets to it. So I would argue that even without a divine being, which I think is difficult to say this without it, but a lot of libertarians say that humans are innately endowed with natural rights. Right. And I think that if you say government endows you with certain rights, then you would have no problem with government taking them away, no matter what the rights be. Right. Government. I mean, there's no reason to complain that government is restricting my right when government granted it to me in the first place. It's kind of like my mom is taking away my toy.
I would answer that simply by saying, does the government have the right to take your life based on whatever its rules? And we can say that laws are arbitrary, but based on arbitrary laws, does the government say, if you do this action, I will take your life? Does the government have that right to do that? So if it does, then it grants you the right to live, and it grants you the right to die if it decides to, take away your right to live.
So it grants you the right to live, and I think I appreciate that, government, for a little while. Whenever you decide that I should be ended, then it's your arbitrary choice to be made. But no, sure. I would disagree with that. So.
Sure, yeah. I mean,
okay, so let's. You want to do a closing?
You can. You're fine. So I'll go ahead.
Okay. So you can watch the other 30 minutes we did. I kind of went over a little bit in that one. I think restricting the individual's right to speech is very dangerous. If you read 1984 and thought crimes, really restricting speech is restricting thought, and that's a lot of what the intent is to get people to think a certain way. And nowadays we call it political correctness, and I don't believe it's government's job to decide what should and should not be allowed in the public square. Hate speech is really the only speech that needs to be protected, because nobody is going to try to suppress love speech or indifferent speech. It's only hate speech that people would protect. And so I think restricting hate speech is a severe restriction on the individual's right to express themselves. So I'll let you go ahead. 30 seconds left.
All right. Thank you again for the debate.
Thanks again for the debate and for the second round as well. Sorry.
Yeah. And I would close simply again by stating, if you believe that the government has both the ability and the responsibility to protect you from the consequences of your speech, then you must concede that the government has both the ability and the responsibility to limit your free speech, even if by limiting it, it serves to protect you. So if you don't want to get, punched in the face, the government can say the best way to avoid getting punched in the face is not